we've heard a lot today about two of the areas that I think are going to be at the heart of US-China competition going forward with the conversations about technology and also the security-focused conversations we've had this afternoon about what's going on in the Asia-Pacific. I think a lot of people know about Graham Allison's book and the Thucydides Trap, where he talks about whether or not conflict between the US and China is inevitable. And I think the areas that we have been talking about today are two of the areas where there's a lot of friction between our two countries and where you see China rising and the US being really uncomfortable and even nervous and even, as someone mentioned earlier, I think hyperventilating about China's up and coming edge in some of these areas. And so I think it's worth exploring a little bit here with our group, and maybe you all can sort of jump in whenever you want to say something. But Kaiser, I thought I would start with you. I love being in Maine. There's so many really thoughtful people here. They're not right in the center of Washington, so they have a bit of a different perspective. The other day, I ran into an old friend who doesn't really follow this, but I was telling him I'm working on US-China, and I always usually make a crack about how it's not going so well. And this person said, yeah, for 40 years, we told them that they should be like us, and then they did that, and now we're mad. And I was really taken aback, because that's not, you never hear that perspective in Washington. It's they were supposed to be like us, they won't be like us, and we were duped, and now we're mad. So I guess you mentioned a couple of areas where, we're probably are the sources of some of this unhappiness that we feel. And I'd just like to touch on a couple of those. You mentioned the sort of the rules and how much is this up and coming innovation incubation in China attributable to what's going on only in China, and how much of it is attributable to things that have been either learned or taken from the US. So I think talking a little bit about how China has used the imbalance in the relationship to its advantage to unfairly sort of appropriate technology would be helpful. Some of the issues about the gap in our values and how we've been disappointed by that. You mentioned ethics. There's an ethics conversation maybe starting in China. I mean, here, data privacy is a big issue. We want to know when someone's going to use our information. That doesn't seem to be the case in China. We're having problems with US companies selling things to be used to collect data on people unwittingly in China. So can you unpack a little bit some of those sources of frustration and anger in the tech and the economic area, I guess?
Sure, certainly. First of all, I think that we have to differentiate between sort of legitimate and illegitimate sources of acquisition of American intellectual property when it comes to these things. There was a lot of fair play learning. I think there's probably the most remarkable transfer of technology that the world has ever seen was facilitated by one American company called Google, which created something called Google Scholar, which was accessible for many years in China, and which allowed Chinese companies to freely access a lot of the cutting-edge research that was being done by our leading research institutions. Fair play, all of that was fair. Yes, there's some that's been ill-gotten. A lot of it I think we have to blame ourselves for because of the short-sighted quarter-to-quarter thinking of our companies who saw an opportunity to get into Chinese markets, quickly made a Faustian pact whereby they would agree to transfer technology to China, and then were miffed somehow that the Chinese then suddenly had this technology, and they could then, it's hard to beat Chinese companies in that market. Well, we talked about gladiatorial combat, and that's very, very much true. I've seen it. I've seen it up close. The blood on the sand is there. But the real problem is if you're an American company and you're going into China and you're trying to compete, especially in the consumer internet sector, what you're essentially doing is you're sending in a manager to compete against an entrepreneur. The manager is going to be worried about what international school to put his children in, about what golf course he's going to play golf on Sunday. He's going to have a family life. He's going to live out in barbarian villas in the north of Beijing.
He's not going to have his bedroll under his desk.
No,
in the
he's not going to have his
office?
bedroll under his desk. Where
He's
his
going to have 996.
That's right. No
996.
996. It's going to be 95. 955. Right.
Or 4.5 maybe.
Right. And he's also, look, he's not as invested. This is not the entirety of his life. He's going to be paid the same irrespective of how much he succeeds. And of course, he's going to be very frustrated. He'll be fighting. I mean, I've described it before as my own situation in that competition. There are a lot of unethical things that are done, and I found it hard to fight with one hand because my other one was holding my nose against the stench of corruption. But really, that local guy is going to be able to make decisions in a stand-up meeting with his senior staff in 5 minutes that would take you 5 weeks. I report to the vice president of international, who reports to the COO, who then reports to the CEO. And so this decision that I need to get done, comes back to me 5 weeks later, and my.
So are you saying that we have to go back to what Yuan was talking about this morning and be more flexible? Has the U.S. you think, lost
absolutely.
Flexibility, and is that part of the problem?
That is part of the problem. I think that even though when companies
do
do it right, when they completely empower local teams, it's still very difficult, unfortunately. It's a very tough competitive environment. We shouldn't expect to win. There was a lot of hubris early on. And I can point to not a single American internet company that has really, truly done well in China. Not a one.
Well, let's take a moment to absorb that sobering thought and turn to, maritime Asia Pacific. And I want to ask you, Dr. Wu, you mentioned that China is a large country. It has more neighbors than any other country in the world, which is pretty stunning to think about. And that it sees some of these neighbors as a security threat. But a lot of China's neighbors see China as a security threat. And I think, they've built up regional organizations to protect themselves and have a hedge. But of course, the US has provided a security de facto guarantee in this region, which some may say would be a hedge against the neighbor's fear of a rising China. So I think one of the big things that people talk about now is that China wants a sphere of influence in East Asia. What I would like to hear from you is, what is it that China wants for security in the Asia-Pacific region, and is there a modus vivendi between China and the US in this area, or are we destined to have clashes?
I think there are two dimensions to answer your question. One is China's own security concerns. The other is how the US-China security dynamics may work to shape China's security environment. As I mentioned in my previous presentation, certainly China wants to see a stable and secure neighborhood from Korean Peninsula to Afghanistan to Southeast Asia. So in some parts of it, actually, China and US can cooperate from Korean Peninsula to Afghanistan. So in that regard, I think it provides some room for two countries to cooperate in this region. Another dimension of the answer to your question is that, to what extent we view the US also as a major security threat, or at least security concern. If you look at the map around China, quite a few of them are the US security allies with US military presence in this region and very strong military ties with the US. What are the implications for China? That is, the US may want to balance rising China through this kind of security ties with China's neighbors. Either Japan or Singapore or India or some in Central Asia. That's something I think China and the US should sit down to talk. And another part of it is certainly we are seeing China's growing military capability. especially on the maritime. For China, it's only natural when its economy grows that can afford to build a stronger military, which will help protect its interests on the maritime from Taiwan to the South China Sea. The question is, how will this spill over into China-US strategic competition in the Western Pacific? And to what extent the US would be willing to live with a more militarily more powerful China in the Western Pacific, and would like to accept some kind of strategic understanding between two countries, that the US doesn't necessarily seek a predominant military position in this region vis-a-vis China. For example, within the so-called fourth island chain, will the US remain to be the single dominant military power in this region, or it would like to accept some kind of Chinese influence in this part of the world, if that doesn't lead to serious destabilizing of the situation in this region? So I think all these kind of things have to be discussed in a serious China-US strategic dialogue.
Mm-hmm. And probably from the US perspective, it would depend a lot on how others in the region, including US allies, feel about a withdrawal of US military presence there. What would that do to the deterrent picture in the region? I've heard Chinese say many times, well, we're building a big military because now we can afford to do so, but that doesn't unfortunately make people very comfortable. Mm-hmm. So the question is, if you were worried about the way the neighbors feel about it, people probably wonder why there's been such a kind of aggressive move into the South China Sea, et cetera. But maybe, Yuki, you could talk a little bit about what Dr. Wu said about sort of this balance in the region.
Sure. I mean, Japan is in the middle of it. And then also, because this is, primary focus on this is on China, and understandably so, we haven't really spent much time talking about it. But then also, South Korea is quite an important factor here, because if there's one really important security issue that China, US, and Japan, and Russia, and South Korea agree, that's North Korea, and the future, how we are moving the situation in the Korean Peninsula in a positive direction. But before I go there, like when Kaiser was talking about this business decision-making tempo, and I was also thinking about the couple of the keywords that keep coming up in the morning's presentation, which is flexibility. I kept thinking about Japan, and Prime Minister Abe down talks about Japan needs to have more innovation. First thing that they did is establish a council who talks about how innovation can happen in Japan. And all the members are probably the population that is farthest away that you can imagine from the concept of innovation. They're beyond certain age group, they're mostly male. Not exactly diverse.
Did you see the congressional
It's like the Chinese
hearing?
leaders who talk about soft power,
Yeah,
right?
right. We had a congressional hearing on tech, and one of the senators held up the phone and said, "Can you tell me how to use my iPhone?" So it was.
To case in point, I believe Japan has this cabinet-level minister at large who's supposed to be in charge of IT innovation. Yeah. I think he coughed up and said, "I never used email."
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, this brings me back to something that Kaiser and I were talking about, which is about who's going to regulate technology.
Right.
And is the pace of innovation now so fast that governments are no longer really going to be able to be players in this space? And
so I think that's where I mentioned a little bit in my remarks about Prime Minister Abe's proposal about let's start talking about this. But the data governance, how to share in how to share data in a secure, transparent way according to the rules that everybody agrees on. And China has to be in the mix. So my worry here is that with this administration approach of withdrawing from TPP, and they have a natural reversion to this multilateral negotiation, doesn't lead to quick deal, So I'm just worried that Prime Minister Abe may not be able to bring President Trump along with it. But if anything special about Prime Minister Abe, he's one of the very few leaders who has not been the subject of being personally destroyed by President's Twitter. There were some
Small club.
Yeah,
That's because he nominated him for a Nobel Prize.
All right.
that too. But that was there even before then. He had to offer the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's in this one, tiny special group. He still hasn't, being destroyed by President Trump. So maybe he can make that happen.
Well, this brings up sort of the whole issue of the international system. We're talking about the TPP. We're talking about climate change agreements and the Asia-Pacific security picture. One of the things that's been a major focus of mine since I left the State Department, and what I really believe is that if for the U.S. To be able to sort of continue to show its leadership in the world, it's going to need to double down and repair and reform the international system. We haven't done such a good job with reform in our own country. I don't know what's going on with Chinese reform, Japanese reform. It doesn't sound like we're able to reform anymore, but I do think the international system needs to be reformed. I think it's been too revisionist in the era of U.S. hyperpower, and we need to get back to basics and fix it. But I want to know, what does China think about, because there's a lot of people who say the Chinese want to just overthrow the international system and start a bunch of parallel institutions and basically overturn the system. And so I'd like to know from you, Dr. Wu, how you see China's role in desires for a strong international system that can pursue peace, security, and discussions on rules about controlling technology, for example.
I think in China there's a basic consensus that China is one of the major beneficiaries of the current international system.
Yes.
Especially on the economic front. Even on the political front, we are one of the prominent members of the United Nations. So Japan is not yet, India is not yet. So we are pretty happy with the political structure in the international system, and economically, as I already mentioned. Maybe China and the US are the two major beneficiaries of globalization and the current international economic system. That doesn't mean the international system should not evolve and should not be improved. I think the complaint for China, as always, is whether the international system should reflect the shifting balance of power among countries, especially between the developing world and developed world. If you look at the IMF and World Bank, the examples is that the governor of World Bank has always been an American, while the governor of IMF has to be an European. We think that's not fair, right? So maybe that was fair, a long time ago when these two institutions were created. But today we think, the leader of the two major institutions should be selected on the merits rather than on the nationality. So that is just one example. We think the international system should be maintained, but it should also evolve to reflect the changing balance of power. Another dimension of this is that we also need to create new institutions to help sustain the current international system. One example is AIIB, right? So because the current multilateral financial institutions like World Bank or ADB, Asia Development Bank, simply cannot meet the demands of infrastructure development in Asia. So China came up with a proposal of creating AIIB. But for the US, this was viewed by the Obama administration as a major challenge to the current international institutions led by the United States. So if the US put the concern of its leadership, the monopoly of leadership, as the #1 concern, that will compromise the current international system. So what the US should do if it really wants to maintain international system is to learn to share the power and leadership with other emerging economies, not just China, but India, Brazil, and others in the coming. So I think that is how the international system should evolve down the road.
Let me just jump in here a little bit because it has to also do with alliances too. Wishenbo actually used the word that I was looking for, which is evolve. So is it going to be, is it going to evolve, or are we looking for revolution? Or are you completely upping everything that we have established in the past, or we start from the baseline that what we've created and then evolve from there, and basically adapting from there. And then I think that's what I think has been ongoing until the administration change happens to Americans' alliances in the region. That U.S., I would say U.S.-Japan alliance because that's the area that I'm more familiar with, but even with alliance with Korea, we were definitely heading toward more shared responsibilities, more reciprocity, let's more integrate what we can do, but then let's start thinking about what this alliance can do vis-a-vis other parts of the world and give a regional one, not supposed to. So basically there were already exercises that are happening to evolve these existing alliances from the relationship that was standing against X for the longest period of time to something that's standing for something.
Yeah.
And in the middle of that exercise, the administration change happened, and then all of a sudden we're having a president where we're going to pull out U.S. military from everywhere if host nation support doesn't meet 100%.
Okay, well, we're not going to do that.
But
So
anyway.
I think that's a good place to turn to the audience for some questions, because this is a very
Can I just
stimulating.
one
Sure.
quick
Get your
thing, though.
questions ready. Kaiser's going to make
One quick thing, though. Because, first of all, I think that the World Bank chair goes to the country with the largest GDP, and that could very soon actually be China, which would be interesting. But Susan, you talk about the provision of these public goods, really, essentially is what we're talking about in the world. And you mentioned this Thucydides trap that Graham Allison wrote about in his book. When I was talking to Joe Nye about this, Joseph Nye was he's a very eminent thinker on international policy. He raised to me the idea of a more worrisome trap, which he calls the Kindleberger trap. Now, Charlie Kindleberger was an MIT historian of economics, and he looked at the disasters of the 1930s and the 1940s, with the rise of fascism and the Holocaust and the war. And he puts the blame on the failure of the rising power in the world, the United States, to supplant the traditional role of the incumbent world power that would have been the UK after the First World War. Their inability to provide public goods in the world no longer had a trade currency or a rules-based order. In the United States, rather than stepping in, passed these bugger thy neighbor tariffs. The Smoot-Hawley Act was isolationist and failed in that way. Here we are in this moment.
Well, first we had the Wilsonian principles, but yeah.
Right. Here we are in this moment when it seems, at least to me, that China is at least trying to, as the rising power, trying to put public goods into the world. And the most notable, not only AIIB, but also, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. The American response, though, has been to sneer, to jeer, and when it stumbles, to cheer. And I worry that is exactly the wrong attitude, that this will produce, if the United States prevails, if it does manage to sell this idea of debt trap diplomacy all over the world, that it will thwart the provision of these important public goods in the world. And I worry about that.
Good point. Yes, let's go to the question up here on the balcony.
Yeah.
Please
Thank you
state
so
your
much.
name and where you're
My
from.
name is Seth Owusu-Efriye. I'm from SPIA, School of Policy and International Affairs, UMaine. I'm from Ghana. Thanks to the leaders of Camden making this program a success. There's one question I want to ask, but before that question, as we talk about, is this Chinese century? There's a continent called Africa that I have the belief that if you are talking about Chinese success at this century, Africa will not be relegated to the background, because last year, the president of China invited almost all the presidents across the continent. Only Botswana didn't go for the summit in Beijing. And the president promised African leaders that he was going to give them close to $60 billion investment, aid, and other things. So I was expecting that at least one of the topics will go. If you are talking about is this Chinese century, what about Africa, any of the topics? But my question goes to Professor Wu. Prof, you made mention of the fact that China sees or has about 20 neighbors. And he's taking it, like seizing the opportunity to have a trade agreement, an economic agreement with these states. They are close to him, fine. What about Africa? Now, I'm from Ghana. Our leaders, they've given our natural resources to China. You go to Nigeria, you go to different countries, they are taking the natural resources. What the African people are saying that it's like China wants to colonize Africa again.
Okay, I think we have to let's let him answer.
So
if that's okay.
my question is, since Africa is quite far from China, and if it were those neighbors and is trying to build a community of one destiny with those people, we will understand. What about Africa? Does China want to have another colonization? That's my question.
Thank you. So what about that? The parallel between on the Belt and Road colonization versus just development aid?
Well, China is already the largest trade partner to Africa and have booming trade relations with a lot of African countries. And also China is becoming a major source of foreign direct investment in Africa. So that kind of ties are only going to grow, even though, as I alluded to, China also pays more attention to its neighborhood. Does this mean that is Chinese colonization? Then you have to redefine what colonization is. Look up in the dictionary and compare what the Europeans did in Africa in the 19th and 18th century. That was colonization. When China came to trade and investment and to buy your natural resources, that's a commercial activity, is not colonization. Do not use this kind of journalism's catchphrase to describe China's activities in Africa.
I do think it would be reasonable for people to to look at things like transparency and standards in the way these projects are done. And I think China has made some mistakes, it's fair to say, in some countries on this point, but is now looking to try to increase standards. One of the things I've wondered about is why does China not use the AIIB, which is the high standard institution that it created, to do more of these Belt and Road projects that seem to be funded through policy banks that have much less oversight in China? But we want to move on to a couple of other questions.
Can I comment on this very question?
Okay.
Why China does not use AIIB to fund the Belt and Road project? Because this is not China's bank. We cannot dictate AIIB. You have to serve the Belt and Road initiative brought about by China. So China is very sensitive to this issue. So far, the largest recipient of loan from AIIB is India. So we have to be very careful because AIIB is a multilateral intergovernmental financial institution. Is not something China can control. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the cooperation will fall apart. I think that's the reason. And instead, China has been using its own resources through bilateral intergovernmental arrangements to deal with this issue.
Great. So I see we have a question coming in from one of our remote sites.
Okay.
And the question you can see up on the screen is coming from Don Holmes in Sedgwick, Maine. He's at our Belfast remote site. So the question is, given tightening government control, what does the future look like for Hong Kong and Taiwan? And I take it that Don means sort of tightening control from Beijing toward Taiwan and toward Hong Kong. And I guess that question is probably again for you, Dr. Wu, if you don't mind, and maybe some other people could also chime in.
Well, as the famous Chinese saying goes, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away, so you just enjoy your life. So Hong Kong and Taiwan are far away from Beijing, so don't worry about that.
Okay.
I'm from Shanghai. I don't worry about that. Anybody from Beijing here?
Okay. Do we have any other questions up here on the balcony? Yes, thanks.
Hello, my name is Katie Scheibner. I'm from the United States Air Force Academy. And my question is regarding just Chinese social media. So given the history that China has of filtering communication platforms, do you think that they desire for their social media platforms to be a global, a global platform for their citizens to connect with the world? And then if so, what could be the implication of the spread of those restricted social media platforms to the developing world?
That's a great question. Thank you very much, Katie.
It
And
seems like
Kaiser,
it's
maybe
like-
you could also, in your response to this, talk a little bit about what the special position of Chinese language on Chinese platforms, what kind of advantages or problems that
Sure.
affords Chinese companies, because it's something we don't think about that often.
Yeah, so the major Chinese social media platforms have not achieved a significant footprint outside of China. I think that there have been some abortive efforts to push them beyond China. They've pulled back WeChat, for example, or Weixin. Tencent, the company behind that, did one really major push. They signed on some major soccer celebrities to do this. And then they've really gutted the marketing efforts for that because they yielded such poor results. Right now, it's basically a platform for people in the Chinese diaspora who use it very, very extensively. I, unfortunately, am forced to use it all the time because I think it's a big pain in the ass, but it just eats up too much of my day to deal with this. But there aren't notable instances of successful Chinese social media platforms outside of China, with one sole exception so far. That's a company called Douyin, or a company called ByteDance, which is a little short video product called Douyin. It released an English language version called TikTok, which had a brief run at the top of the Apple iTunes App Store. But I don't think that it's, look, there's worry about the export of censorship into some of the developing countries into which these Chinese products are going. These should not be taken lightly. They should be looked at quite seriously. But I don't think that it's these Chinese products themselves. The very things that have made Chinese internet companies successful within China, and by which I mean the tight integration with banking and commercial infrastructure within China, cripple them when they try to go abroad. None of them have done very well. These companies are not well staffed with cosmopolitan people who understand markets outside of China. And frankly, they need to focus their competition domestically. There's an enormous domestic market. And I'm sorry, you asked me to add to
About the Chinese language aspect of the social.
Right. I mean, I think that there's some of that. They do work in other languages. The interfaces are fine in other languages, but the peculiarly dense nature of Chinese, the way that in what used to be a 140 character tweet in English, you could offer a couple of pithy little maxims or jokes or what have you, snarky remarks. Whereas in 140 characters in Chinese, it can be a freaking novel. I mean, it's true. You can
definitely be a poem.
So, Chinese social media is boundlessly fascinating. It is an unbelievable showcase of the wits and the humor and the kind of clever ways with which they circumvent censorship or bypass it or use all the innumerable homophones available to you in Chinese to be able to do very, very funny things. Just one example. For a while, the Me Too movement was becoming quite popular. And so, of course, the censors banned METOO, hashtag Me Too. And so the Chinese started getting kind of clever. Then they said, well, you know what, we'll use homophones. We started talking about the rice rabbit, the Me Too. And then, of course, because then they were wise to that, so they started using emojis. They found a little rice emoji and a little rabbit emoji, and so the little rice emoji and the rabbit emoji was good enough to know you were talking about the Me Too.
That's innovation.
That is innovation. Right.
Okay.
And I've always believed that, adversity is the best stimulus to
Right.
innovation.
That's right. Okay, we have a question down here, please.
Hi, I'm John Davidson from Camden, Maine, and I wanted to address the issue that you just raised of Peking is far away. And given Peking is far away, how should your neighbors feel about the building up of the islands and the atolls that appear to be potential use for military purposes?
Again, that's you, Dr.
Yeah, that's back to you, I'm afraid. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm afraid so. We thought we were going to avoid
got
the
off
South
easy.
China Sea question, but it's not. It's going to come back. So.
Now you have to look at what purpose China is going to use these facilities. Whether China is going to build a military base abroad, or it's mainly for a commercial purpose. So it's easy to tell. I think for China, if it wants to exert military presence on the foreign soil, it has to make major adjustment of its foreign policy principle. That's non-aligned movement, no alliance with another country. So that's a major taboo in China's foreign policy. If one day you say China announced we're going to give up this principle, then that may be a signal that we are going to build military bases abroad. Other than that, I don't think you have to worry that China, maybe like the United States, are going to build the military bases in a global context. Okay.
Okay. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on that? Because my comment on that would be, it may be the case now that you think so, but it's hard to say what might happen in a few years.
Well,
and
I
I
mean,
think when other countries are looking at it, they can't necessarily bank on what people say today. They have to sort of look out and plan for maybe other scenarios in the future.
There are military airstrips and surface-to-air missile batteries on these islands.
Right.
It's hard to argue that they're for purely commercial purposes. Now, that said, no shipping so far has been interdicted. There have been no shots fired in anger in the South China Sea by China since March of 1988. I think that there have been a lot of very dangerous close calls in the South China Sea. American phone ops operations continue apace. That is probably the biggest potential flashpoint in the area. But this has been happening. Aggressive buildup has been happening since 2008 to 2009. Am I right, Susan?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, even
No,
before
I
that.
think the military, some military deployment on, if you talk about the South China Sea issue on those islands, this will become irrelevant 7 years from now as China starts to deploy aircraft carrier battle groups in South China Sea. That's far more important than
Sure.
deployment of some weapon system on those small islands. Those small islands actually are very vulnerable if there is a serious military conflict with others, particularly with the United States. They can only become the target of attack. So if China really wants to strengthen its military presence in South China Sea, that's the deployment of aircraft carrier battle groups. So I think that will make this island issue much less relevant.
Well, since I feel bad about getting off too easy here, let me insert. I would just offer it to you that it's not only military assets that the Chinese, the neighbors in Asia Pacific are seeing that they feel either threatening or unnerving, because in case you haven't noticed, Chinese have a very large and strong Coast Guard. And those Coast Guard ships and cutters sometimes are much bigger in tonnage and what they can carry and what they can do. And they're areas of they can go a long distance. So it's not just purely military capability that makes potentially the neighbors nervous about intentions. I would just add that.
Okay, I think we did have one question. Did we up there in the balcony? Yes?
Okay.
Oh, I think there was.
Or,
Yeah.
oh, the screen. Okay, great. So Sarah Stadler in Woodstock, Vermont, at our Dartmouth remote location, wants to know, what is China's policy with respect to Russia and the Arctic?
Okay.
So I think, Dr. Wu, we're back to you again, and maybe just a quick short answer. And then I also do want to talk about, because you've gotten a lot of questions in this vein, and I do want to have a chance for our panelists to talk about, someone raised it here, I think all three of you raised, what are the areas of potential cooperation for the US and China? We haven't given enough attention maybe on that point. So if we don't get to that, please remind me to come back to it. But Arctic policy.
Well, I think China-Russian relations are very good, not only politically, but also on the security front. As I mentioned, both are the founders of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And in recent years, the economic relations between China and Russia also developed rapidly, largely because of the Western sanctions on Russia. To some extent, I think the US played a role in bringing China and Russia much closer over the last several years, starting with Obama's policy towards Russia and China, respectively. Having said that, I don't think China and Russia will ever become former allies, because either because there's no need, or simply they do not want to turn this relationship into that kind of arrangement. China's policy with respect to Arctic, I think China, for 2 or 3 reasons, are becoming more and more interested in the Arctic. One is for scientific research. Second is for transportation, especially usually on the way back from U.S. From New York to Shanghai, we fly over the Arctic. We think in the future, maybe the Arctic will be suitable for ship transportation in the future.
Well, we're going to work hard on climate change mitigation, and we're going to hope that we don't get to that point.
Possibly this will happen someday. The third reason, I think, is that the resources there, if countries are going to extract oil and other resources in Arctic, China will be very much interested in that.
Okay, great. We have a question over here.
Thank you. I'm Brewster Grace from Rockland. This is for Yuki. I thank you very much for your very careful delineation of all the balancing act that Japan is having to go through, as so many vagaries exist around the world. But at the same time, I'm wondering what Shinzo Abe is trying to do with the amendment of the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, and how this will have an impact on every other thing the relations that Japan has to carry out.
Great, thank you.
So it can be a really long answer, but I'll keep it short. Great question. Actually, I need to write about this next week for Australian Journal, so that got me start my thinking for my homework going. It is true that Mr. Abe has been thinking about this for quite a long time, but there is a question of what he wants to do with it, but then there's a whole another set of questions of can he do it actually? And I can tell you from the Japanese political climate right now that even if he really wants to do it, I don't think he has enough political capital to move it. He needs to focus this year on successfully hosting G20 earlier in the year, imperial succession and related ceremonies and events throughout the year, but then also he needs to see whether he can have another good election result for his own party in the summer. So there are plenty of issues that takes up his political oxygen, if you will, and political energy for him to actually serve out his current term. Because if he falters in, let's say, for example, if his coalition, ruling coalition loses very badly in summer, there will be a voice about accountability. Because there are some people who are already wary in Japan about all the things that Mr. Abe was doing. It's mostly related to his domestic agenda, but then there are definitely this ideological discomfort in how fast he tries to take this constitutional revision issue forward. So there's a question of what he wants to do, but then I would say I don't know if he can even get to the point of whether he can actually do what he wants to do. And another thing is, even if he, let's say for example, if he has really successful year this year, looking certain he's going to serve out, even with that, what he will be able to do will be fairly limited. Because, look, for better or for worse, Japanese forces, self-defense forces, has not been deployed overseas in active combat mission since 1945. They've seen those self-defense force folks to do good things, disaster relief, peacekeeping operation. Even that was 20 years ago deemed too dangerous or too threatening. So from that to open the door to the potential that Japan can somehow engage in some faraway land to actual combat mission is a big leap, and I just don't think Japanese public is ready for it.
Okay, we got 3 questions at least, so I'm going to take all the questions up here in the balcony first.
So the conference started with an ad from Google, and this is the same Google that's partnering with the Chinese government to develop a censored search engine.
They've dropped it.
They've dropped it, but it was a project that was condemned, by human rights groups all over the world. So where is the space for human rights, specifically censorship, in this discussion of China's economic success and technological success?
And please just give us your name and where you're from.
Andrew Nolan from the University of Maine.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Can we also take the question that's over here?
Fred Benson, Mount Desert Island, Maine. At the end of the day, I'll leave here thinking that none of you believes that war between our two countries is inevitable. I agree. In fact, I think it's quite unlikely. But there's always a possibility, and the possibility occurs when one of the two parties makes a mistake to which the other has to respond. In fact, I would argue that we are at war today in cyberspace. We all possess weapons that are the cheapest weapons ever made, a desktop computer. At a rate of some dozens per day, the Pentagon and other secret sites are hacked by China. How do you see this factoring into your assessment of future relationships?
Great, thanks. And then is there a question from a remote site, Jim? Okay, last question goes to John Mazur from Edward Little High School in Rockland. Does China see the US as a strategic rival? And if so, what steps can be taken to improve relations? Okay, these are 3 great questions to wrap up on, and we've got a little bit more than 2 minutes, but human rights, I think
Censorship.
this question about, is kinetic conflict even relevant in the age of cyberspace is a good one, and what does that lead us to? And then the strategic rival. So let's start with you, Kaiser, and we'll go this way.
Okay, I'll take the censorship.
Quick.
Right. I'm actually one of the few people who would have argued that Google, even if they were going to push into China with a censored search engine, still provides choice where there is little choice right now. That it would have been better They did this after all from 2006 to 2010. They had a censored search engine that, from the point of view of people in China, some choice, some broadening of information horizons, some competition to make Baidu, a company I work for, have a little bit of goddamn competition and work a little harder. That would have all been a good thing. And I think that we were so moralistic, so sanctimonious about our hardcore stance against censorship that we were totally blind to the actual needs of Chinese internet users. I'll stop with that one.
Okay, thanks.
So just very quickly on the cyber, absolutely. I highly recommend Andrea Krepinovich's book that have a 7 deadly scenario. And one of them was exactly that war was fought and over before single fire was shot, because everything took over, basically, it was done over cyberspace. So
but we're not at war.
We're not at war, but that was one of those scenarios that was laid out. But I think that is definitely what my friends at Pentagon constantly thinks about. And then this is where the discussion needs to happen in a multilateral way about how to govern that space.
Absolutely, yes. Dr. Wu?
Well, China-US relations is always featured by cooperation and competition. So for the part of competition, we are the strategic rival to each other. So that's part of the truth in this relationship. How to improve this relationship? We need constructive and frank strategic dialogue at the highest level between two countries. And we also need to continue to forge strong and vibrant economic and social bonds between our two countries and two peoples. And finally, the two militaries and security establishments in both countries need to develop mechanisms to reduce risk and avoid unnecessary conflicts. So there are a lot of things can be done, and I believe that our people here can contribute to this process. I believe the Camden Conference can contribute to this process.
Yeah.